Was the Roman military the well-oiled machine portrayed in many films, TV series, video games, and other works of historical fiction? Today, we're going to finish up a short series we've been doing on the military of the Pax Romana. We're going to look at discipline. How did soldiers train? What kinds of physical conditioning did they undergo? Did they engage in mock battles? What kind of oaths did they take? Did they endure punishments? What rewards could they hope to win? We'll also talk about the sources that complicate the picture, that suggest a military that was plagued by corruption, laziness, and even cowardice. What picture of the Roman military should we believe? The Pax Romana seems like the very peak of Roman power, but was this because of the Roman military or in spite of it? We'll talk about it today on the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 46, The Roman Military, Part 3. Before we begin, I'd just like to thank you who are regular listeners for enduring a bit of a hiatus. As I mentioned in the last episode, I was doing some traveling and speaking, and it just was a whirlwind. I was in Switzerland and Italy and Israel and the United States. I gave a talk at the York Festival of Ideas. I did a few podcast interviews. Some of those will be showing up soon, so check out, for example, BBC's History Extra podcast. We had some family travel that then overlapped with these things. All that's just to say it was an exhausting month or so. I'm glad to be back in the saddle in front of the microphone, and you can expect the weekly episodes to once again resume. If you're new to the podcast, I encourage you to check out my new book, Pax Romana, The Plague That Shook the Roman World. And don't hesitate to email me if you want to chat about Roman history. Call in at paxromanapodcast.com. You're welcome to hit me up on Twitter as well. Very easy handle, Prof CPE, PROFCPE, and we can chat there as well. All right, on to today's episode. The Roman army wasn't just a fighting force, but a vital part of Roman society, its economy, and its political system. While defeating enemies was obviously the core purpose of the Roman military, the effectiveness of the Roman army relied on training and discipline and experienced soldiers, all of these supported by a complex organization that adapted alongside Roman society. On the one hand, we have plenty of evidence of good discipline, and this from the very beginning of the Pax Romana. So you know from parts 1 and 2 of this series, so episodes 44 and 45, that slaves, for example, could not just join up with the legions. But let me add that the enlistment process involved other checks as well. In addition to proving free birth and free status, recruits to the Roman military endured a medical exam. They had to take eyesight tests, for example, and in order to keep the military numbers quite high, the Roman military at any given time during the Pax Romana was at least 100,000 soldiers strong, in some cases as much as 500,000 soldiers. Well, to hold on to numbers like that, about 10,000 or more recruits would have had to have been pulled into the army every year. So, when a young recruit entered the military, at that point, he swore an oath to obey his generals, to enforce strict personal discipline, and to be subordinate to the Roman state and, of course, its emperor. The oath reinforced the prerogative of military commanders to punish soldiers harshly, even incorporating capital punishment. One of the older oaths in the Roman military that was still probably around by the time of the Pax Romana also required soldiers to pledge loyalty and stay together in battle. This was probably an oath that was sworn separate to the oath to commanders and to the emperor. It was a kind of oath of camaraderie among soldiers. And these oaths weren't simply symbolic. The officers in the Roman military received daily reports, which documented everything from the total number of soldiers under their command, including breakdowns for specialized units like, camel riders and cavalry. They kept track of the officers and commanders. There was a daily password that needed to be learned each morning. The reports also detailed any personnel changes, new orders for that day, and oaths of allegiance were sworn each day by soldiers. It goes without saying that officers had to be literate. These reports don't mean anything if you can't read. As men rose through the ranks of the military, these men needed to either have pre-existing or gradually gain familiarity with the various cultural affectations of the officer class. Everything from writing styles for official communications to hygiene habits, social cues, that sort of thing. It was not a foregone conclusion that just based on merit, one would be able to succeed as an officer in the military of the Pax Romana. So we have reports, we have officers, we have accountability. It seems like we're probably talking about a disciplined institution when we think about the Roman military. And we have sources that suggest that even Rome's enemies had glowing things to say about Roman military discipline. So this, for example, is Josephus. Josephus was a general over Jewish rebels during the Jewish revolt in the AD 60s, and we talked about that revolt on episode 24, if you wish to check that out. Josephus, however, defected, and he was given Roman citizenship, and then he wrote a pretty lengthy and useful and fortunately surviving history of the Jewish War, in which he praised the discipline of the Roman legions. This is a lengthy quotation, but it gives you a pretty good sense of at least his perspective on the Roman military and its discipline. Quote, "The soldiers take up their tents by companies, quietly and in good order. All their fatigue duties are performed with the same discipline, the same regard for security, the procuring of wood, food supplies, and water as required. Each party has its allocated task. The same precision is maintained on the battlefield. The troops wheel smartly round in the requisite direction, and whether advancing to the attack or retreating, all move as a unit at the word of command. When the camp is to be broken up, the trumpet sounds a first call. At that, none remain idle. Instantly, at this signal, they strike the tents and make all ready for departure. The trumpet sounds a second call to prepare for the march. At once, they pile their baggage on the mules and other beasts of burden and stand ready to start, like runners breasting the cord on the race course. They then set fire to the encampment, both because they can easily construct another on the spot and to prevent the enemy from ever making use of it." That is Josephus in his Jewish War. I don't really need to say much on this. If this is true, it suggests that daily life in a Roman camp was highly ordered, even to the point of trumpets sounding to announce various functions that, according to Josephus, all soldiers simply followed without really any exceptions. We see here a military that is highly disciplined, almost robotic. And we do have evidence that the military was trained, at least ideally, to be able to deliver such performances. Military training was rigorous, focused on discipline and stamina and coordination. That was the MO of the Roman military. New recruits learned to march around 20 miles in about 5 hours. They learned how to build marching camps, to use heavy wooden practice swords and shields so that they could build their strength. Roman soldiers were fit, they were strong, they had good conditioning. They knew how to follow orders. And not just as individuals. Military training was also done at the level of the unit, even including mock battles. Cavalry trained in complex formation, they threw missiles, and learned how to coordinate not just themselves, but their animals as well. And yet, Probably the best example of Roman discipline are the stories we have about how Roman soldiers approached their enemies. At times during the Pax Romana, the legions used silence as a kind of weapon. The undisciplined enemies of Rome, at least as they're portrayed in the sources, of course would scream, they would charge prematurely. Germanic and Celtic warband, for example, in Roman sources are often portrayed as highly individualistic in their fighting style, which of course led to broken formations, gaps in their lines, which the more supposedly disciplined and organized Roman legions took advantage of. Roman troops, on the other hand, even the infantry, marched in an unnerving silence. So the other side would be shouting, acting all crazy, but the Romans would just stand there silent. And this almost oppressive quiet was held back only by discipline. I'm sure soldiers wanted to yell. It helps relieve nervousness during a conflict in which there is a very real chance that many of those soldiers would die. But Roman troops, more often than not, just stood there quietly. And as their enemy charged, they would then send a volley of spears and then one single, united, blood-curdling war cry, and then the Roman charge. This tactic, when it was used, was a kind of brutal 1-2 punch. The physical shock of the spear and javelin barrage combined with the psychological terror of the silence, followed by a sudden, unified, singular roar. Maintaining the silence obviously demanded extraordinary discipline. It was a testament to the rigorous training of Romans, that they could hold their ground and hold their lines. And so when they actually met the enemy on the field, sometimes even before they actually clashed weapons, the enemy was likely to retreat after just a short skirmish. It was important for the Romans to be quiet because their officers used musical instruments, including trumpets, as we saw in Josephus, to signal orders. This was true in camps, but it was also true in the battle. We know about several different maneuvers and tactics in the battlefield. The most famous of these is the testudo, which you probably heard of, or maybe even seen in a film. The maneuver resembles a turtle shell. It involved legionaries interlocking these long rectangular shields that they carried to create a protective wall on all sides, which would allow soldiers to approach enemy fortifications and then undermine them. They would walk together with their shields locked together, protecting them obviously from missile fire. We actually have inscriptions from the era of the Pax Romana showing soldiers using the testudo. So this formation was not simply an invention of Roman writers. Soldiers during the Pax Romana were exempt from torture. They weren't subject to the delays of civilian courts. They were able to get justice from the military directly, and of course, this often favored them, especially when the other side was not in the military. So there were some real legal privileges to being a soldier during the Pax Romana, and I think the idea was that these privileges would be offset by the military discipline, both the personal discipline of soldiers, but also the discipline enforced by commanders. And it's true, Roman soldiers faced a harsh and unpredictable at times disciplinary system. Centurions in the military walked around with canes, which they would use to beat soldiers that had violated rules and laws. And these laws and rules were not always spelled out. Officers had pretty broad authority to punish soldiers that did anything that threatened kind of the order or security of the military, from treason to desertion. These were considered crimes in the military. Soldiers that betrayed the camp or fled battle, soldiers that struck an officer, even faking illness to avoid duty. These things could bring about harsh beatings or even death. Even minor offenses could stack up and earn capital punishment. So repeated offenses might lead to the death penalty. Desertion obviously was a huge problem for the Roman army. It was a serious offense, but there was one way out of but the penalty for desertion could be lessened if a soldier returned on his own. If you were captured, however, or even worse, you defect to the other side, the death penalty was always enacted. If a unit displayed particularly egregious cowardice in the field, so not necessarily desertion, but they disobeyed orders in such a way that it made the whole unit look bad, Roman commanders could, and this was rare, but it did happen occasionally, decimate the unit. We have that term in our modern vernacular. We speak about something being decimated. We usually take that to mean it was destroyed, but decimation comes from the Latin word for tenth. And what happened was the unit drew lots, and every 10th soldier got a short straw and was then clubbed to death by his comrades right there in front of everybody. Now, the question is, how often did infractions like these occur? There are actually quite a few accounts suggesting that the Roman military was not always disciplined, that in some times and places, corruption and violence, abuse of citizens, and even rebellion ran rampant. Now, these are sources that come from elite writers, and during the Pax Romana, they increasingly saw the professional Roman soldiers as immoral and even uncivilized. These were men who did not own land. They received a salary, rather, from the state. There are also emperors that some elites didn't like, and instead of criticizing those emperors directly, these authors would criticize the military under those emperors, claiming that the soldiers were undisciplined or corrupt as a way to say that their leaders, particularly their emperor, was undisciplined and corrupt. Elite writers, of course, feared, and rightly so, the political power wielded by the military, and hence the lower classes as well, because the military did, on occasion, rebel against emperors or install emperors of their choosing. And this was a huge threat to elite prerogatives about who should be emperor or who shouldn't be emperor. And as we saw in sort of the first 10 episodes of this podcast, the Roman Principate itself, the Pax Romana, was a product of a military coup. Augustus tried to change his image, he changed his name, but he was ultimately a warlord who won power by having the biggest, the best, and the most ruthless military. And no amount of window dressing or monumental architecture or religious innovation can change that fact. And so we have accounts of soldiers stealing property, kidnapping locals and selling them for ransom, forcing locals to do work for them. The biblical idea of going the extra mile is related to this exact thing of a civilian being requisitioned by the military to do work, and then Jesus saying, well, you should do more work. Citizens were subject to random acts of violence from soldiers, beatings, murders, rape. Soldiers demanded bribes. Even officers accepted bribes from their own soldiers to overlook offenses or to give special treatment or privileges. We don't just have to guess that this kind of thing happened in the military on a kind of commonsensical basis because this thing probably happens in most militaries. We have evidence. So the rhetorician Fronto, and he was the tutor of future emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. Fronto was their teacher. This is what he said about Roman soldiers. And again, this is a bit long, but it's an interesting contrast to what Josephus said. Roman soldiers are, quote, demoralized with luxury and immorality and prolonged idleness. The soldiers at Antioch were wont to spend their time clapping actors and were more often found in the nearest cafe garden than in the ranks. Horses shaggy from neglect, but every hair plucked from their riders. A rare sight was a soldier with arm or leg hairy. Few of the soldiers could vault upon their steeds. The rest scrambled clumsily up by dint of heel or knee or ham. Not many could make their spears hurtle. Most tossed them like toy lances without verve or vigor. Gambling was rife in camp, sleeping night long, or if a watch was kept, it was over the wine cups. That's Fronto in a letter to Lucius Verus. So that's Fronto speaking to the emperor. And even more so, that's Lucius Verus's army. Lucius Verus, as we'll see in a future episode, led a war against Persia at the beginning of his reign in the 160s. Lucius Verus goes to Antioch, and his military is totally out of control. And this is his teacher, Fronto, telling the emperor, this is what your military was like. They were terrible. So some historians, especially popular historians that want to praise the Roman military, will point to the harsh punishments and the reward system as evidence that the military was disciplined. But of course, you don't have a system of rewards and punishments if your military is doing just fine. You have those things because there is a problem. The Roman army relied on a strict system of rewards and punishments. Soldiers craved recognition from their superiors and peers, while punishments for breaking the rules were harsh, and this is because such things were needed. The rewards were pretty impressive, by the way. Soldiers could earn gold crowns if they saved the life of a citizen or scaled enemy walls. Officers could receive silver spears. Medallions would be passed out. We have several examples of those that survive. Neck rings, armbands, and these were displayed with pride by the soldiers who won them, attached to their armor, worn along with their battle gear. Many military trophies were meant to be worn, probably to inspire other soldiers so that they could see those rewards and then want to earn them themselves. Now, if you weren't a Roman citizen and you fought instead in an auxiliary unit, you weren't usually given individual rewards, but your unit could be honored with titles that reflected attributes like courage or obedience. If a unit was especially proficient in battle, the commander might give the entire unit citizenship, even ahead of retirement. So I think that's enough to be said about Roman military discipline. Obviously, we have a system of rules and laws and rewards aimed at keeping the army in fighting form to discourage desertion and cowardice. We see discretion among commanders, but also plenty of evidence that despite the institutionalization of discipline, Roman soldiers could be just as corrupt and lazy as anybody else in the Roman Empire. And so now that you know more about the Roman military, we can move forward with the story of the Pax Romana on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.